First of all, massive thank you to Chris for inviting me today. It's a real honor to be presenting to all of you, and thank you to everyone that has kind of signed up and joined as well. I really hope that this kind of next couple of hours is kind of insightful. Prop artists are, while they've always been around, it's kind of becoming a bit more of a niche role as games get bigger and there's more fidelity allowed. So yeah, I'll get started. And yeah, as Chris was saying, apologies if there's any hiccups. Obviously, presenting remotely always carries that risk of things not going to plan. But yeah, so yeah, I'm Hannah Watts. I'm a senior prop artist at Ubisoft Reflections in Newcastle. I've been there for 2 years. I have been in the industry since 2014. That's when I graduated. I was at Abertay University in Dundee, which was a skill set accredited uni. And since then, I've worked in indie, I've worked in AA, I've worked in AAA, obviously at Ubisoft. And I've also done a lot of freelance and contracting for clients. I've always kind of juggled freelance and contract work at the same time. And outsourcing studios as well. I did a kind of 2-year stint at Decagon. If you are particularly kind of interested in asset creation and prop creation, you might have seen their work on ArtStation. So just to give a little bit of background, I'll just show a little bit of my own work. This is kind of a mixture of contract work and personal. Some of it will be these two at the top are from kind of comprehensive texturing tutorials I've done, which are available online. The embalming machine goes over texturing in Marmoset Toolbag. So yeah, if you ever want to check them out, they're available. And again, just a mix of personal and contract work. So it's kind of not as well known about me and my work, but I do also work in stylized projects as well. My time at CoatSync, which was kind of an indie / AA studio, was mostly VR and Switch titles. I've done some stylist work for Decagon as well. Oh, I won't skip just yet, but yeah. So while I do specialize in realism, I for my career, for my enjoyment of art and 3D as a platform, I kind of enjoy being able to switch between realism and stylized, especially when it comes to freelance and getting a little bit of extra income. So yeah, I guess I'll start. Before I launch into an hour-long discussion about kind of pipelines and techniques and everything, I think I should probably define what a prop is. So props or assets can encompass a few different things. Most people, when they think of props, will probably think of kind of small static props. I've kind of got some examples here. This isn't my work, but these are just really good examples of kind of prop kits that I found on ArtStation. These I'm hoping you guys can see my cursor, but these ones on the right from The Witcher. So these might be what you think of when you think of props, which are kind of small items that can be used for building levels and set dressing. But props can also include kind of medium large assets as well. They can include spaceships that might be crashed in the scene, or mechanical machines, vehicles that aren't actually driven, static vehicles, that kind of thing. And it can also include buildings and architecture kits. That very much depends on the studio and kind of how they divvy up their art teams. But prop artists or content creators can sometimes be tasked with much larger tasks as well. So as I said, small props are probably what people think of when they first think of props. And these are kind of the small self-contained items that will be used to populate the world and give it a little bit of context. Again, just taking some examples from other artists on ArtStation. And small props are most likely to have unique texture maps. They don't obviously take up as much physical space in the game, so you can adhere to target textile densities just using bespoke maps. You do tend to avoid using really large textures or very dense geometry for props like these. It changes slightly if it's a small prop that's always in the camera, or the player has to pick up and interact with if it's important to the story. You probably would afford it a little bit more geometry or texture space. But yeah, generally small props are kind of, in the namesake, they're small, they're self-contained, they'll be quite quick to make. But artists might also be asked to make variants of these props. For example, this chair in the green, you might be tasked with kind of recoloring that or making various states. So you might be asked to make kind of a new version, but a ripped version as well. And they tend to go into libraries in the engine for level dressers, if you have them, to place in the scene. Or if you're more of a kind of generalist, a 3D generalist, you might be also tasked with kind of placing them in the scene as well. So as I mentioned in the other slide, medium to large props, they use additional workflows in addition to the kind of the bespoke traditional texturing that you'd get in smaller ones. You have hero props, which are, again, it depends on the project, but you might have something that's very important to the story that the player interacts with, or it just takes up a lot of space in the world. And in that situation, you may be allowed to use multiple texture sets if there's a lot of bespoke detailing, or you might be allowed to use multi-materials, which is where one mesh can have, between 3 and 10 materials on it, some of which might be tiling. And it's just a way of achieving kind of consistent texture sizes across the mesh without having to use like a million 8K textures. So with medium to large props, obviously they are quite significant. So artists will have to work with design and level artists, and sometimes other disciplines if needed, just to work out kind of the gameplay impact and the metrics, and kind of making sure you have all the information before you start constructing them, because obviously the larger the prop, then it's also going to be a bigger time investment. There's more considerations before you jump in and start modeling. Projects might also have custom shaders to handle large props. I won't really be going into that in this talk. It's quite a kind of complex topic to get into. But just be aware that kind of sometimes projects or engines might have custom shaders that you can kind of feed specific types of textures or vertex painting into, and they can drive the texturing in engine. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier as well, some studios might classify buildings as large props or assets as well. Then the example here on the right is a really good example from World of Tanks. These buildings look like they've been, they will have used techniques that I just mentioned, but they look kind of self-contained, almost like little dioramas that I assume are then placed in the engine. So yeah, it's good for if you are planning to go into prop art or content creation. You should still be comfortable working with larger assets as well. So prop artists can also transition into other disciplines. You can stay as a content creator, that's that's exactly what I do. But sometimes you'll find that after a few years of people working on very specific areas, they might transition into that role formally. So, for example, if they're kind of a generalist and they find that they've specialized in vegetation or buildings in the game, they might transition into a formal role that reflects that. So, obviously, there is kind of weapons arts, there's vegetation art, vehicle art, architecture. And you sometimes, again, depending on the studio, sometimes see kind of geology teams that will work purely on the terrain and cliffs and rocks. And they'll tend to be kind of absolute wizards with ZBrush, or photogrammetry as well as another useful tool for that. And each of these disciplines will tend to have their own bespoke specialist software or pipelines, in addition to the kind of traditional ones that you'd know from game art. So yeah, I wanted to kind of mention this just so that people are aware that there's so many kind of disciplines within just content creation itself. So if you do find that you're, leaning towards a certain type of content, that might be something worth considering as well. So this next section is just it's quite a short one, but it's what makes a good prop artist. So the first one is observation, and that's observation in terms of the size and the scale of the items that you're making. Obviously, when you are in a 3D space, especially in VR as well, when you're actually kind of immersed in the world, size and scale is imperative, and you kind of have to make sure that you get that correct. Otherwise, it can break immersion, but it can also have very serious kind of gameplay impacts as well. But it also means composition of elements within the prop. So in these pictures at the bottom here, for example, if you were making a door and you made, the door itself was to scale, but you made the door handle really, really tiny or massive, people are going to pick up on that. Likewise, buttons on a control panel or handles that a player has to pick up with. It's very important that kind of all elements within an item are kind of well scaled and measured correctly as well, especially if it is going to be like a gameplay prop. Usually projects will define kind of player metrics that you have to be conscious of. Hand positioning should kind of go on this kind of area, that kind of thing. Another kind of aspect of observation to consider is how has this item been made in real life? A common misconception in artists that are starting out, and I was certainly guilty of this as well, is that when modeling, everything that you're modeling has to be one mesh. And I remember, I think I was in my first year of uni, and I was trying to make this really complex kind of Victorian fireplace all out of one mesh. Every world had to be together, like every vert had to be welded, sorry. And it's impossible. And it's also not correct as well. So actually, it creates better assets and makes your life so much easier if you aim to construct an item as it would be constructed in real life, and separating parts out that make sense to do so. Just on the example to the top right here. I just pulled this from another artist's 80 level article, but yeah, this gives a good example of how they're using the Unreal Mannequin just to measure out some architecture pieces and kind of plan out how big their arches and railings are going to be. So the second kind of observation point is more to do with the surfacing rather than the modeling. By this point, you'd assume that the rest of your model is pretty solid. But that is like the observational eye in terms of materials. So it sounds super obvious, but like on paper, but sometimes just if you're kind of modeling something if you're texturing something and it's just not looking quite like your reference, or it's just not feeling kind of like how a corroded metal will feel. Sometimes, for me anyway, I just delete all my layers and I actually go back and look at the science, and I read up on kind of why, does brass oxidize, or, why does copper have all these different colors in it? And sometimes you have to go back and really understand how a surface reacts to kind of chemicals around it, or corrosion, or how it ages over time. Does human usage leave marks or scratches or scuffs on it? The weather conditions, if you're given a brief for a prop and it's going to be left outside, then it's probably going to show signs of kind of rain damage and sun exposure. So things like that, when you're looking at reference, aspects like that are really kind of important to consider as well. So just to kind of illustrate what I mean, this photograph is of, I took it in Tokyo pre-pandemic, obviously, so it was a while ago, but I think it was like a vending machine on the street. But I really loved, it looks like such a mundane item, but I just loved the layering of age and kind of human-made marks on the surface. And this is, I'll kind of talk through, but this is kind of when you've got references of something you're making, this is kind of how you should analyze them. You should kind of don't just look at the obvious things, really dig down into the references and kind of try and work out why things are a certain way. So, for example, at the top here, Again, I hope you can see my cursor. But you can see that there's kind of remnants of paper that have been left. Obviously, something's been stuck there and it's then been ripped off, and it's left these kind of horrible, like grey, moldy looking bits. You also have the tape adhesive here that's also started to crack. I'm sure you've all probably dealt with sellotape that you've left on something for ages and it's got that horrible, like yellow, crinkly, like horrible texture. And that's evident here as well. You've got permanent marker that's obviously been drawn on and then rubbed away over time, but then it's kind of stayed stronger around crevices where maybe things aren't brushing against it as much. And these are the kind of storytelling elements that you can bring into texturing. Likewise, this is an antique recorder that I took a photograph in an antique shop. It's not as the kind of layering of like age and story isn't as obvious as in the vending machine, but it is there. So you can see that there's kind of like these white specks and dust, and some of them are quite large for dust as well, which to me implies that it's maybe been left in a garage, or maybe it's been in the shop for a while and the white paint from the walls has kind of flecked off over time and spattered it. You also have, the chipping away of the gold plating and bits of grime layering up. It's also quite an interesting prop, even without all the aging. You have a lot of kind of different textures. You've got the grey and the white plastic, which is dominant. You've got the gold accents, but then you also have a pop of primary colours. And when I'm looking at props to do for my personal work, it's kind of things like this I tend to pick just because I quite like working with multiple different materials in one prop. I think they make for kind of interesting viewing. So another aspect that makes a good prop artist is knowing when to save time. As I mentioned at the very start of the presentation, small props will kind of be more likely to have unique, bespoke, one-to-one textures. But actually, a lot of props made kind of in all studios I've worked at will make use of kind of trims and kits and atlases to save time. Basically, reuse is key. There's multiple different kind of methodologies for reuse. It depends on the project. It depends what resources you have access to. But some of the most common ones are obviously modular kits, in which artists will be tasked to make kind of Lego block components. This obviously does apply to architecture, but it can apply to kind of prop kits as well. If you think about kind of spaceships, maybe you'd make like a bunch of different pipes and a bunch of different panels in different kind of variations of like conditions as well. Likewise, atlas sheets it's more known about now. I think a few years ago it was a bit of a kind of well-kept secret about how to use atlas sheets and trims, but I feel like more people are aware of how to use them to their advantage now. But that would be where like it could be seen as a generic material, so that you'd have a texture sheet and you'd move the UVs around as needed to capture whatever information. Another aspect, which is obviously gaining popularity, is using photogrammetry to make kits and atlases. This is a really good example from Far Cry 6, where the artist kind of used photogrammetry to capture clothes from both sides, and then would use them to assemble multiple variations of clothes lines, which obviously fall under a prop kind of definition or content definition. So I thought that was like a really unique method, and means that you don't have to spend ages in Marvelous Designer making digital clothes. So this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about day-to-day responsibilities. This is maybe a little bit less kind of art focused, purely because we actually, contrary to what people think, we actually don't spend all our time doing art. We spend a lot of it doing art, but there's a lot of other things that are involved with working in a studio. There's some days, where I'm just doing purely admin, or I'm in a lot of meetings, or you're just working on briefs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what other things prop artists kind of have to consider. So the first is research and development. This kind of stage or step is very dependent on the project and the company that you work for. Sometimes if you are tasked with creating content for an environment, sometimes you'll handle the briefs yourself. You'll maybe work with the lead artist or the lead designer or the kind of the visual director, whoever, and you'll come up with a list of assets that you think the environment needs, and you'll put together the proposals, which obviously involves kind of your own research, your own image collection. But sometimes on the flip side, you actually might receive those briefs yourself, especially if you work for an outsourced studio. In those situations, it might be that someone else has made the briefs and you're responding to them. So even when in the latter situation, even when I receive a brief, especially if I'm doing kind of freelance work with clients, I still spend an hour or two researching what I'm going to be making. Even if I'm, given the most amazing reference from the client, I find that sometimes sitting down and kind of really digging into, what is this thing? How's it made? What other images can I find? I really kind of immerse myself in the task and familiarize myself with what I'm making. And for actual kind of storing of this reference, I use either PureRef, which is an actual application. It's just like a mood board. It's very loose. You can drag things on, you can make annotations. But I'm starting to use Miro more, which it's an online version. I think you can get an app as well. But I'm starting to lean towards Miro because it's very whiteboardy. Multiple people can join and comment. You can embed videos, you can embed links. It's really great for if I'm doing client work and there's like a lot of things I have to consider on top of the actual just research images. Miro is great for me just to kind of have everything that I need in one place. And sometimes if I feel it's helpful, I also dig into if I can find any blueprints or user manuals or product specifications of the thing I'm making. As you can see with the cafe till, I did make a cafe till myself, and finding these blueprints just made it removed the guesswork of trying to figure out, the dimensions, the size of the asset when I've got kind of actual real world measurements there. So after the kind of research stage, after the proposals or briefs have been approved or you've been given the go-ahead, then the first stage is blockout or proxy props. And these act as placeholders in the game or the app. So these are just kind of very simple gray box assets. Sometimes you can apply kind of flat colors to them if that's the way that the project's working. But they're just very simple gray box assets that kind of capture the core size and shape of whatever the asset is that you're making. And then usually you would then put them in the engine. You'd have to make sure that they'd have to have baseline functionality. So they'd have to probably have like basic collision meshes, basic material setup, naming conventions, etc. So yeah, you put them on, you put them in the engine, and then either the level artists or the designers can then place those blockouts to test out ideas. It also means teams aren't blocked, because it means that like if artists and designers have blockouts to be working with, they're not waiting for you to finish your really high fidelity complex prop. They can kind of do their job while you're doing yours. Again, obviously a lot of my work is currently like NDA, so I've had to kind of show other artists for this section, but this is a really good example of using blockouts on Unreal 4 by Victor. You can see like he's kind of captured the core shapes of things, and he's been able to set up he's kind of look dev a basic lighting setup as well. So he's been able to work on the shape and the lighting without having to make all of these and take all of these props to final. So once the blockouts have been signed off, normally there'll be a lead review or designer review or whoever of the blockouts, either individually or as a level. Once they're signed off and you're given the go-ahead, that's when you actually start digging into making the prop. So most studios will allocate a set amount of time for the asset. how strict that is depends on the deadlines in the studios. If you're working for outsourced studios, they'll probably be a little bit stricter because they've budgeted, like they've given their clients a set like amount of money, or they've kind of billed them, sorry, and then they'll work it out. How do we divvy that up amongst the assets we've agreed to make? So that's when it tends to be a little bit stricter. In studios, again, depends on the place, but they might use tools like Trello or Jira for task management. And you'll normally work with producers and your leads to kind of work out how long tasks are going to take, whether is there any change requests? Is it going to take longer than you thought? So generally, people are quite flexible, obviously, as long as you're not taking the cake and taking like 3 weeks to make a tiny chair. But yeah, it's one thing that I always advise students is to at least kind of familiarize yourself with using some sort of project management, even if it's Trello, which I think is free still. Just because it's such a day-to-day thing. Like I always use Jira every day. And yeah, the approach. So you normally start thinking about approaches in this section as well. How you approach the asset depends on what it is, where it's being used, plus any gameplay or optimization considerations as well. So this is just a kind of loose look at how the process might go. Again, it changes depending on the project and the studio and the actual asset itself as well. But usually you will have an initial brief or request that might go to concept art if you're lucky enough to have the resources. If not, you would probably jump straight into reference gathering. If you do have concept art, you'd be using the two together. You probably would still, even if there was concept art, you would still have to do your own reference, because concept art usually it's quite loose and expressive. Obviously, concept artists have to do a lot of pieces in a very short amount of time, so it's very unlikely they'd sit and kind of detail the model that you need to make or the asset that you need to make. It's more likely it'll be loose and expressive, and then it's up to you for then take that as a jumping off point and do your own reference gathering. After this, it would move to blockout, which would then be reviewed. This is where it gets a bit like it depends on the asset. Usually, I then take something to mid poly. Mid poly is kind of it's a step between blockout and actually jumping straight into the high poly. So I'd start to flesh out more of the kind of complex silhouette of the asset. I'd start thinking about, as I said earlier, how is it constructed? And you'd start breaking it up a lot more. I would also start planning, am I going to use any tiling materials on this? If so, I'm probably going to start blocking those in and at least considering where they're going to go. If not, or if it only uses partially high poly, then I'll start on the high poly. These will then get usually reviewed by either your lead or designers or directors, especially after the high poly, because once you start getting to all this stuff, it's very time intensive. If there's something wrong with the high poly, it's very time intensive to go back and kind of redo it all from this point. So you would get it reviewed. It would then you'd go to either you'd make your bake meshes or your low poly. You would then obviously unwrap it. I did miss a point. I forgot to put the baking step in. So obviously once it's been unwrapped, if you're using a high poly, then you would take it to the baking stage. If you're not, if it's just using completely like trims or generic materials, then obviously you would skip the baking stage because there's no unique textures. Texturing again is kind of similar. If it's just using generic materials, then there would be a texturing stage. But if it does have its own one-to-one unique texture, then obviously you would take it to the texturing. I think the most commonly used ones at the moment are Substance Painter, and some people are starting to use Toolbag 4 and their texturing suite. You would then assemble the final mesh. This can be, if you've worked with bake meshes where you're planning on like repeating a lot of elements, which I will get into on the future slides, then this is just where you actually, you clone everything round. You maybe do like a kind of wonky pass if everything's very straight, you might go and add some extra edge loops and kind of move things around. You basically assemble the final mesh that's going to go in game. Then it's the actual engine steps. You would create your collision meshes, your level of detail meshes. Again, I'll go into these in future slides. And you would then implement an engine. How difficult this is depends on the engine and the studio that you're working at. And also kind of what rules are in place, if there's any validation rules or any specific proprietary steps. And then usually at the end, there is a final review. This can be one-to-one with your lead, or sometimes studios do kind of peer reviews with the whole art team. So I touched on these a little bit earlier, but kits and atlases, sometimes prop artists might be tasked with making kits or atlases or batches. The terminology is kind of loose, but basically these are, well, how it sounds really. They're kits of things. You might be tasked with making the individual components. You might then use them yourself, or or other artists might be using them as well. It might be specific to the level. You might be making a kit that then gets used by the whole team. These tasks can also be handled by material artists, if there is any on the project. Again, that's with the advent of Substance Designer like a few years ago and photogrammetry. That's kind of a newish role in the last 5 years. So not every project, not every studio will have dedicated material artists. So examples of kits or atlases, brick or concrete trims, mechanical pieces for kind of kit bashing. If you think of kind of like you might make loads of kind of cogs and modular pipes and levers, and then in the engine you might kind of like arrange them and bash them together to make kind of endless varieties of mechanical pieces. Spaceship parts are similar, or various types of wood planks pieces. So this is just an example of a quick trim kit I made for a Decagon client. It was basically just 3 bars that tiled, and then a bracket which was mapped to the bottom left of the trim sheet. And then basically it meant that when I handed these to the level builders on this project, they could make like any sort of beams that they wanted, any sort of combination, and really like hack these pieces together. And it just all read from one 2048 texture. Likewise, this is an artist from New World Interactive it's in Insurgency. I don't know for sure how they made this kit, but I would imagine they made a few kind of pieces of individual wood, and then they made some trims of different types of wood, and there was maybe between 1 and 3 texture sets, and they kind of used that to make this whole landscape. It obviously can be a little bit repetitive. It has to work in conjunction, with other props and other materials, but trims and atlases are such a powerful way of making things quickly. Implementation, again, is very project specific, but it's something that you do have to be aware of. It does fall within your responsibilities. So once the prop has been signed off, either at blockout stage or at final, you have to start preparing the engine specific aspects. The first one that I usually make is collision meshes. Collision meshes are kind of really cheap geometry that it's invisible to like the player, to the audience, but the engine uses them for navigation or kind of bullet detection, hit detection, that kind of thing, and sometimes in gameplay elements as well. They should be as cheap as possible. You don't want really jagged collision, both because it starts to be more expensive, but it also can cause kind of sticky navigation where if you have like a collision that's kind of like spiky, the players can get stuck on it because the physics gets confused. You generally don't want any smoothing groups on collision meshes because smoothing groups, again, add a layer of expensiveness to them. Some engines can generate their own automatic collisions. Whether it depends on the asset you're making. Sometimes it is best to just let the engine do it, and it's quick, it saves you time. But sometimes for more complex assets, it's probably better to go in and make your own collision, especially if you know it's going to have real impacts on navigation. So yeah, I won't dig into these too much, but just so you're aware, it's worth reading up and at least being aware of what collision meshes are and kind of how to work with them. Likewise, LODs, I probably should have changed the title. I split these slides in two, so this should just say LODs. But so yeah, so LODs stands for level of detail. This again depends whether the project is using them. Most games do because it keeps things cheap. So a level of detail mesh is a technique to like reduce mesh complexity the further an asset gets from the camera. When something is right close to the player, it will be at LOD level 0, which means that's the mesh that you've made as you put it in. You know, that's it's kind of baseline. How big the asset is depends how many levels of like LOD meshes you then make. Buildings could have up to 4 or 5 LODs. Really small assets might only have kind of 2 or 3 levels, and after that they just disappear. You can't see them anymore. So yeah, as I said, LODs help massively with performance and stop the engines from chugging. They can be made by hand, or they can be generated automatically with third-party software like Simply Gone. And yeah, so I already mentioned collision meshes, but both collision meshes and LOD meshes should adhere to whatever naming conventions your project's using. This again is something that I feel people aren't always aware of when they first go into the industry. But naming conventions are like almost as important as the art itself. It's up to usually like the tech leads or the art leads to define these, and they'll usually be documented. So if you join a studio and you're onboarding, there'll probably be kind of an onboard section about what naming conventions, what file formats they use, how they expect things delivered. So this last section is just a breakdown of one of the props I've made recently. Just talking, it was for one of my friends, and it just talks a little bit about the process from first receiving the brief to actually having to submit a finished asset for them to implement in game. So I was tasked with creating a temple lantern for the player to hold, and I can't talk. I have permission to show the piece I've done, but I can't talk too much about the game itself. But the brief that I had was basically it needed to be a high fidelity lantern, realistic, PBR, and the player was going to hold it. So that was my first initial brief. They had no concept art of it. So that kind of the design, the direction to take the lantern in was kind of, up to me. So the first thing that I did was I jumped on a call with the guys, and I was like, okay, I know it's a lantern, I know it's in a temple, but I need more. And then we basically just had a chat about, what is the context of the game, how important is this asset to the narrative, how old is the setting? Is it going to be like a new lantern, or is it going to be old and battered? And that's when you're taking on a more complex brief. They're the kind of, like, even in a studio, they're the kind of conversations you can expect to have with your leads or your producers before you start anything. So after that call, I knew that the game was heavily driven by mythology, so the context of the asset was important, but I also found out that it was a high priority asset that was held by the player. Because it was always in camera, I could afford it higher texture sizes, more texture sets, and more geometry as well. Similar to weapons, you can have weapons, up to kind of 30,000, 50,000 tries now, because they're always in shot. They're so close to the player that you don't want any junkiness or faceting on the geometry. You want everything to be really smooth. So first of all, I collected references. So these are just some shots from my Miro. This also acted as a sort of proposal to the clients, because they didn't have any concept art. They weren't totally sure which direction they wanted the lantern either. It was as much about getting them on board as it was researching myself. The nature of it being from a shrine meant that there was potentially sensitive information with like religion and spirituality. So it was kind of really important that I did my due diligence and, really researched the kind of folklore and legends and the the religious aspects. I also looked for close-up shots of the grime and the wear and the kind of connections on the lantern, how they were constructed, how have they aged, especially with a lot of these being kind of antiques. And yeah, just after I put all this together, then I jumped in another call, similar to what I was saying in the flow chart before. That was almost like a lead review. I jumped in the call, presented what I'd found. We had a discussion, and in the end, they liked aspects from various different ones, and then that kind of brings me on to the next stage, which was it was then up to me to kind of experiment. So as I said, they didn't have any concept art, so it was kind of this is why the blockout stage is so important because I could play with designs very quickly and very cheaply. You can get away with a bare amount of detail, just enough to get a sense of shape and proportion. So in these blockouts, I kind of took what we discussed on the call, where they said, they liked a couple of the different hats on the lantern. They liked a couple of different handles. They quite liked the flower shape, but they also quite liked this shape as well. So I did actually make a few more than this, but I basically almost kit bashed them. I made like a bunch of hats, I made a bunch of handles, and I basically mashed them together and presented them all. I basically handed each one as an FBX and was like, test them in game and get back to me and tell me which ones you think you want to go with. I also something I haven't really touched on in the kind of day-to-day responsibilities, but sometimes you will be expected to rig your props as well, especially if it's something that the player either holds or interacts with. Obviously for this, it has little bells, so they would, you'd expect them to kind of jingle in the engine, and I rigged the doors as well. So yeah, you don't have to know like a ton about rigging, but you should know how to do a basic rig. So I always start with the high poly first. Some artists like to work mid to high to low. I think in a professional setting in work, I'd probably work mid to high to low just because it gives more review time. But I think if it's personal work or if it's freelance or if I'm really sure of the direction that I'm going, then I'll start with high to low. For me, working high onwards, that allows me to kind of figure out the prop. I'll start with the biggest shape. I'll work that out, and I'll start with the second biggest, and then I'll kind of work down in order of size and significance. And it allows me to really kind of dig into how the prop's made, and construct it in a way that makes sense. And I can also kind of, if things are going wrong, I can sort of take a step back and maybe actually I've made some elements incorrectly, and I need to like fix the scale and stuff. So for modeling, I'm a 3ds Max user, and I take advantage of a lot of modifiers. I tend to work quite non-destructively. I'll have very, very large modifier stacks. I generally use a combination of turbo smooth, chamfers, open sub-D with crease sets, and various things like tapers, morphs, bends, and they all get stored in 3ds Max's modifiers. One thing to be careful of, and it's something I always warn people of, is 3ds Max is great for stacking modifiers. If you kind of really dig into what Max is doing, it can be almost as powerful as Blender. But there is a horrible bug that seems to have plagued 3ds Max for about 6 years. If you have a lot of edit polys in one stack, each vert has a reference, and 3ds Max can lose track of the reference. And then 4 stacks into the edit polys, you end up with basically the verts all just corrupt, and your beautiful mesh becomes a spiky ball of triangles and verts. And basically, once that happens, unless you've got autosaves, you just can't get it back. So I usually I will work with a lot of modifier stacks, but I will have autosaves on, and I will normally kind of clone the model or the models, the elements at certain stages. I'll move them out of the way, I'll hide them, and I'll collapse them down. So at least if something bad happens, I've got versions to go back to. If an object is very aged or organic, or there's kind of complex surfacing that I think needs to be in the geometry and not just the texturing, then I will take it into ZBrush and I'll do a sculpting pass. So I did that on the lantern. I did a very loose, very light sculpting pass just to get some of that kind of warped bent metal, especially because brass and copper they're very soft metals and they do kind of dint quite easily. So as I said, there was no concept art, but I knew that the client did want these kind of illustrated decorative lantern panels. I'm quite fortunate that I have like a traditional art background. I did oil painting in college before university, so I still enjoy kind of 2D aspects, which served me well here, because basically I spent another few hours collecting various references for kind of Japanese mythology. I looked at books that detailed kind of trends and motifs that were common in like old Japanese art and sculpture. I kind of studied and internalized them, and then I basically got my iPad out. I've just got like a 10-inch iPad Pro, got up on Procreate, and I just sat with my reference on my monitors and I just sketched out some ideas. Super rough. I'm not by any means a good 2D artist, but it's just a very quick way of testing things out that would just take hours to do if you were trying to concept them in 3D. If you're not comfortable with 2D art, you can also photo bash and make collages. But I kind of just wanted to highlight that sometimes, you might be asked to do something quite ornate or quite complex that there is no concept art for, and sometimes kind of being open to other methods of art making can make your life easier. You can also see in the bottom here, I also used this method to make some alphas in order to engrave kind of ornate details into the metal as well. So when making my high poly, I tend to work non-destructively on each element. Obviously, I've already mentioned modifier stacks, but I will keep them as long as I can without collapsing them. And that's because when it comes to the low poly, I can, and I don't always do this, but it's like a good starting off point. I can duplicate whatever piece. I can remove all the kind of high poly elements, right down to the very base. Oh, and then that leaves me like with a really good starting piece for the low poly. So you can see on the handle thing, it's super smooth because of there's some of my modifiers, and then once I delete them all, it kind of obviously I wouldn't want to go back to the very base cylinder, but once I remove a ton, it kind of it's much lower poly, and I would still obviously go in and delete a load of these. I would probably smooth some other bits out. I would delete the hole in the side, but I personally like working that way because it already matches the shape, the location, the silhouette, and I can basically just kind of modify it and smooth it out as I go. So other techniques for doing low polys is, of course, just box modeling over the high poly, or you can use retopology solutions like 3D Coat, ZBrush, or TopoGun. I will call out 3ds Max's new retopology tools, which are in 2020 onwards. I had a little look at them maybe a couple of months ago, and actually they do a pretty good job. I think Max's Autodesk is finally kind of revamping a lot of their tools in Max and Maya to kind of compete with competition. So yeah, totally worth digging into. I will say as well, if this was just a static mesh that was going to be just in the environment, just hanging up, maybe they were light sources, I would not afford these kind of bolts any geometry. I would just let the normal map handle those. But as I said earlier, because this is in the player's site all of the time, I didn't want the normal map to do the heavy lifting. It becomes really obvious. It becomes very last gen. So I decided to use geometry to kind of support the silhouette. I won't kind of go into the fundamentals of UV unwrapping because that could be kind of a lecture in and of itself. So I'll just took a little bit. I always use textile density checkers to check that everything's consistent across the mesh. There's so many out there. Every artist tends to have their favorite one. This one here is just 3ds Max. Kind of like with the retopology tools, they now got like their own inbuilt texture checker, which they didn't used to have. So I just use that for convenience. But yeah, you can find loads online. I'll jump to this point next, actually. So when I checked my textile density, it kind of became clear I was going to have to split the materials up in order to achieve the kind of clarity that I wanted in the textures, especially with all the kind of ornate engravings. So I decided to split the textures into three texture sets. One for the kind of top of the lantern. So that kind of included the handle, the hat, the bells, and then one for the bottom of the lantern, which was kind of like the main frame downwards. And then I did a third one, which isn't on here, but that was for the lantern panels, which I'll show in a second. But yeah, so the reason I did this was you could just, squish it all onto one 4K texture set. But I actually split it out. So this was 2K, this was 2K, and then the detailed panels were 1K. And having those is like, it's like a 2K, 2K, and a 1K. That is so much cheaper than one big 4K because they fit in. There's four 2K textures and one 4K, and I obviously had less. So that's like a good way to think about it as well. Kind of, is it more efficient to just split the texture sets up? There will be an extra draw core for the extra material, but it's kind of about balancing it. For unwrapping, I use 3ds Max, but I do sometimes use Rhizome UV as well. They have a good bridge between Autodesk Suites and Rhizome. But for this, I just use 3ds Max because it was quite a simple unwrap, really. A good tip as well, straighten as many UV shells as you can. If you have bars like this, don't have them diagonally because you get less pixels per shell if something's diagonal, and you can end up with like, because it has to alias basically to achieve the diagonal. So yeah, straighten as many strips as you can before you start hitting distortion. So baking, again, I won't go too much into like the science of this. I personally use Marmoset Toolbag 4. Baking is something you get better at with practice. You start to kind of learn what causes janky bakes and what you can get away with and what's causing issues. But yeah, I use Toolbag 4 mostly because I really like their bake groups function, which uses the naming convention, so like _high, _low, and that will kind of auto-populate groups, which I'll show in the next slide. But they also have skew and cage painting to correct bake errors. Again, I'll show that in the next slide. But that can really help kind of mitigate bake errors, or if your kind of cage or envelope isn't quite reaching the high poly, you can do that in Marmoset without having to kind of manually go back and redo your meshes. In my low poly, I obviously wanted to save as much texture space as possible, so I repeated a lot of elements. I used symmetry and mirroring, and when I bake it, it can look a little bit strange. You can see here, like it's kind of missing a few things, and that's because I knew that later on, after texturing, I was going to kind of duplicate them and reassemble them. So the hat was split down the middle. I knew I could get away with having a seam because they were under these kind of little spokes. The spokes themselves, I only made one, and then I repeated them. Same with the bells. These bars, I made three, and then I just mirrored them around the other side. And likewise, as with the hat, I just made one side of the base and mirrored it over. So yeah, this is just a little look at the Marmoset baking. As you can see, these are kind of the bake groups that will be automatically detected. You can see there's a high, there's a low, and it's automatically detected where to place things. Because of this format, it does mean like if something goes wrong with one of these and you decide to like maybe replace it with a piece you've then taken into ZBrush, but you don't want to reload the whole thing, you can just you can import meshes and bring them into groups, and it will still kind of bake them. So it's quite flexible. And yeah, so this is a look at the skew and offset tools, which you can use to kind of improve breaks if you're getting kind of weird artifacts. Again, I won't go too much into these, but these are well documented on Toolbag's website and YouTube as well. So as I mentioned, I first had a conversation with the client about kind of how aged they wanted the lantern. There were some excellent examples of really new ones online, and there was some examples of, really old battered ones that were like, barely hanging on. And they wanted a kind of middle ground. They didn't want it brand new, and they didn't want it really, really fancy, but they didn't want it completely battered either. They said they wanted a kind of like a local shrine that didn't have a ton of money but did take care of their things. So I went with a kind of in the middle kind of brass. It's not totally patinaed, but it's not really shiny either. It has kind of been exposed to the elements. So I knew that the brass or the copper was going to be the dominant material. So I spent a while in Substance Painter creating my own smart material. You could obviously also do this in Designer as well. I quite like creating smart materials in Painter just because I have the asset already there. You can also obviously just, you could use Substance Sampler as well, or Quicksilver Mixer. There's so many ways to make different materials now. But I knew that once I'd made this material, I could then apply it to the other texture sets, and then that's like, it creates a really consistent, solid base across the whole asset. So I started with a base copper, played around with like hue adjustments, and then I built up a discoloration with base colors and grunge masks and generators. I added some light patina or oxidation for like roughness variation. I then start working on the dirt and dust. That dirt and dust is something I usually do towards the end because it can be quite distracting. You kind of want to get your basic material nailed down. And then that's when I start to then do the really fine details. I'll do, smudges and wipes, fingerprints, specks of dirt, stuff like that. And I save those for, they're like the kind of the icing on the cake. So this isn't as big of a deal for obviously this prop because I was handing this to a client, but for personal things, rendering presentation is as important, as any of the other steps. You do want to spend ages modeling and texturing a prop just to kind of present it really badly or really small or use really dark lighting so people can't see kind of all the hard work you've put in. So you want to spend just as much time on kind of lighting setups and picking your HDRI if you're using one as you would with the rest of the process. You can also try adding like ground planes or building kind of like little out of focus dioramas or virtual softboxes. You need to add a nice backdrop to add some ground contact shadows. In terms of presentation solutions, you can use obviously Toolbag, Unreal 405, Unity. You can use Substance. That's meant to say Substance Stager, not Sampler. But yeah, Substance Stager is like Adobe's kind of little like lightweight real-time viewer. It does have ray tracing in it as well. And you can use Sketchfab as well if you want to showcase your model online. They have some really powerful tools. It's actually quite impressive what you can get done on Sketchfab for it being based on the browser. Yeah, a range of close-ups and far shots add nice variety to your portfolio. You want to play around with like dynamic angles, interesting views. This is where like studying kind of cinematography and photography and stuff can really help. And yeah, finally, the post-processing effects and camera adjustments are key as well. Again, I don't know a lot about kind of traditional photography, but it can kind of translate into 3D really well, especially when it comes to kind of setting up your cameras and taking good presentation shots. But yeah, always don't skimp on the presentation basically, because that can make or break an asset or a portfolio piece. But yeah, that brings me to the end of the talk. Thank you so much for listening. Obviously I can't see the chat, so I really hope there's been no problems or like audio issues the whole way.
Here we go. Yeah, welcome back. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Hannah. That was fantastic. It was really great to see such a sort of in-depth breakdown as well as what you do. I think it's something that we often don't get with guests. So it was great to see. So thank you very much. I think there's been some questions already. I have enabled our students. You should be able to activate your microphones now. So I would say if you do have a question, because there's quite a few of you, just use a little raise hand icon, and then we'll sort of put the questions forward like that. So it's always difficult when you can't read social cues of face-to-face, things like this. And we have got a couple of questions in the chat already, some of which have already been answered through your chat, but then there's a couple else there already, such as what's the difference for you between working in realism and stylized? And how does the initial design sort of differ, or the pipeline, how would that might sort of change between realism and stylized?
That's a really good question, actually. It's quite a multifaceted answer as well. I'd say stylized. I think sometimes people have the kind of misconception that it's easier because I think people kind of assume that kind of achieving realism because it's so like, oh wow, it's like real life but 3D, that's kind of harder. But I actually think like they're kind of difficult for different reasons. So like stylized, you have to lean on art fundamentals a lot more, especially even more so if there's no concept art and you're working on a stylized brief. That's really hard because you have to take a lot of agency and a lot of creative decisions yourself. If it's hand painted, then obviously you have to have kind of good painting skills. You have to have a lot stronger kind of color theory knowledge. More so if if it's painted or if it's very flat color. You sometimes see 3D artists, their styles can be they're just they're just flat colors, and they will lean on things like kind of composition and color theory to make very appealing images. So in that respect, stylized does require kind of more solid art fundamentals. Realism obviously starts to get more technical. You'll be working with complex shaders. You have to have really good observation for kind of surfacing and materials. You have to be PBR correct. Obviously, as I mentioned, you also have to you can't stylize silhouettes really. You have to kind of you have to adhere to real life. So they are very different. Likewise, in stylized briefs, that can be technical in its own right because maybe it's stylized because you're working on a very kind of limited platform. Maybe you're working in VR and you don't have as much of a poly count to work with. So then it's kind of like, how do you get the most bang for your buck? How do you make an attractive asset or an attractive environment with very limited budget?
Feel free to hang on, someone's pinging. Feel free, guys, if you want to turn on your mics or turn on your cameras as well. It's always nice to sort of look at faces rather than just blank screens. I know some are in the studio next door, so there's no cameras involved there anyway. But feel free, if you've got mics, please turn on and pose any questions, or if you're one of the guests, please enter into your chat. So we've got one here from Chloe. What advice would you give to people who are new to prop design?
Oh, that's a tough one. Practice is probably the biggest one. You kind of need like kind of solid fundamentals in a lot of areas. So obviously your modeling needs to be quite strong because you could be tasked with making all sorts of things. Like even now, after doing it for years, I sometimes get tasks where I have no idea how I'm going to start it, and I have to really sit down and break down the task. But kind of sometimes watching YouTube tutorials or YouTube videos of speed modeling, or if you're a 3ds Max user, there's a guy called Aramis who takes requests for complex shapes. That's very important if you're doing a lot of hard surface things that might have very strange topology, and you're getting kind of weird smoothing as you're modeling. So yeah, you definitely need strong modeling fundamentals. Also an eye for kind of making things unique. Obviously, I'm on ArtStation. I'm sure we've all seen there's a lot of wooden barrels, there's a lot of wooden crates, there's a lot of AK-47s, and these are great kind of practicing pieces. So it's probably best if you're familiarizing yourself with a piece of software to kind of do something tried and tested, because then you've got benchmarks there to kind of compare yourself against. But certainly, if you're wanting to work on a portfolio piece, then you should be look at doing something kind of interesting that stands out of the crowd, or maybe has a bit of story to it. Something that kind of resonates with something you're interested in. So then when you're making it, that kind of comes through.
Yeah, I think, sorry, so it's the notifications are pinging through, it's throwing me. No, I think that's good. I think it's a very sort of difficult question to sort of approach that one. So what about common mistakes? What common mistakes do you see in portfolio work or people that's trying to break into an industry? What are the sort of cardinal sins or sort of things that you'll see that instantly would kind of turn you away?
Again, that's a kind of multifaceted one. There's kind of a few areas that we would obviously look at if we were kind of reviewing someone's portfolio. The first one is poor use of topology. Say if you imagine, let me think of an example. If you imagine like a fuel tank, or something that you might get like a shipyard or a factory. If you imagine like a freestanding kind of fuel tank or something. Someone that's kind of modeled the cylinder, and then maybe the topology there is pretty good and optimal, but captures the shape. But then if we zoomed in and we started seeing that all the individual bolts or nuts were like 700 polys, and they were kind of modeled in with these really dense spheres rather than using the normal map, that to us would flag there's not much awareness of kind of geometry budgets there. If you kind of not spending much on a bigger area, but then you're spending loads on kind of little areas, and that would kind of raise concerns. Likewise, if we can tell in the texturing, if people have just kind of shoved on a dirt generator and not tweaked any of the parameters and they're using it out the box, that to us would kind of indicate that the texturing skills maybe need a bit more development. I always advise against kind of using smart masks or smart materials straight out of the box, because kind of like how in a lot of games you can see that a lot of leaks are taken from textures.com, you start to notice the same leaks over and over again, then you start to notice the same kind of material usage.
Yeah, so I suppose it's that demonstration of knowledge of the sort of the wider context, isn't it, and how it's applied in the final output to some extent, isn't it? So yeah, okay. We've got some of coming through here. So at what point did you realize that you wanted to sort of specialize towards props? Was it kind of more organic? How did you find your way to props as opposed to any of the other sort of categories?
It was actually quite organic. So when I went to uni, I went to uni in 2010, and originally I had my heart set on being a 3D animator. I think I did one module of animation and absolutely hated it. I just don't have the patience. It doesn't agree with my kind of temperament. And so I kind of floated around for a little bit. I did a little bit of kind of painting, again, because I'd come from that kind of traditional background in college. But it didn't resonate. I was kind of doing enough just to get by with my grades, but I was like, I don't want to be a concept artist either. And it was eventually just before final year, which is really cutting it fine to decide what I wanted to do. But I did a kind of worldwide competition called Dare to Be Digital. I don't know if they still run it anymore, but it was basically lots of teams from different universities throughout the world would kind of get together, make games over the summer, and they would compete. And it was actually meeting the artists from other unis and seeing what other students got up to. I realized that 3D was actually more accessible than I thought it had been. So that's how I got into 3D, and then from there it was actually kind of like organic. An organic process, really. I worked at CodeSync, which was, like, as I said, like a VR and Switch titles for quite a while. And it was actually while I was working on a scene, I started to really dig into making kind of props as realistic as I could for the scene. Obviously, ultimately, it meant that the scene didn't get finished, but I discovered kind of my love for content creation and creating assets.
So is that carried quite nice to one of the other questions I saw going in there, in terms of when do you know when to stop and stop kind of fiddling with an area, and just sort of move on to the next kind of element, so to speak?
I think personal work, even now I'm guilty of, I could just tinker away at it forever. But you kind of get a sense of when you're in in the studio, because if you're working on an asset and everyone around you is being quite quick, but then in every day, every stand-up every morning, you're like, oh, I'm still working on this asset. I think you start to realize that you should probably be wrapping it up quite quickly. Usually it depends again on the importance, the priority of the asset. If it's something that's the player is going to interact with, or it's going to be seen a lot, then people will probably give you a little bit more time, because yeah, people are going to be seeing this thing all the time, and it's probably quite important to reflect like the quality, the caliber of the game through it. But if it's just in the background, then you get it good enough, and then there's always chance. Well, in theory, there's always chance to come back and revisit it later and do a polished pass. But really, you kind of want to bring the game up at all at the same level, and then kind of readdress things in a polished stage.
So that when you're working in the studio then, and you're working, is it, or how much of a team sort of element is there? Obviously, if you're working individual on an asset, are you still getting sort of constant feedback from other sort of artists, or do you often feel quite sort of isolated within your sort of role?
It very much depends on the place. A good team structure would have no one feeling isolated, but still allow people to have kind of personal working days where they're maybe not bothered by meetings as much. And it needs to be a balance, but people can't be siloed away all of the time, because they start to like disconnect, and also like work in isolation, which can result in discrepancies in our style. So it very much depends on the place, who's leading, what kind of culture is coming from top down. Generally, I've always worked in like very good places that adopt a good team culture, and there's a lot of visibility on work, and people are complimentary, but will also give feedback. But yeah, it depends on the place, and it's something that if you're interviewing somewhere, you should definitely ask about.
Got another question here in terms of sort of the difficulty level and the difference between realism and sort of, or something that's completely fantasy. So is it easier if you're working with if you've got kind of historical or real context, against something that's sort of fantasy, which is completely designed from scratch with no existing reference?
If a really good style guide's been set by the kind of creative directors or the leads, then working in a like fantastical setting shouldn't be any harder than working in a realistic one. Obviously, that if there is no style guide, if things aren't well documented, if there's not much of like a benchmarking been done, then that can be a bit trickier. Especially given COVID. If you've got a lot of people working remotely and you're not in the same space, then yeah, there would be challenges, because kind of interpreting briefs can mean different things to different people. So that's when studios have to rely on creative vision documents and style guides, and thorough documentation, and hopefully they might have done like a kind of vertical slice or a slice of life that you can then use as reference. But even within realism, there's style guides as well. You've got hyper realism, where everything's like super crisp, and if you think of like hyper realistic paintings, where a lot of them will tend to be of like really reflective Coke cans or water ripples, it's because their audiences, the hyper realistic kind of sphere, is focusing on capturing all those little details. But then you've got more kind of expressive realism, where it is realistic, the lighting will do a lot of the heavy lifting, but maybe there's not as much detail everywhere else. So there's still style guides within realism for sure.
Do you have like a personal favorite, like, of what you prefer to kind of work on and produce yourself?
Personally, I'm actually pretty project agnostic. I like working on briefs that the lantern was a really fun one, because I had a lot of creative freedom, and the obviously the guys got me involved on like the kind of narrative exploration as well. And it obviously did include a bit of 2D as well. So I like briefs that are more creative. It's not so much about the style or the pipeline, but things I can get my teeth into is stuff I personally like.
And what was the timeline on that? How long did that one take you to produce?
It was spread out quite sporadically, but I'd say if I condensed it, probably just under a week. There was quite a bit of back and forth with like designs and meetings and making sure I was on the right path. And to be honest, there was actually quite a lot of challenge with the I'd drawn up the panels as you saw in the presentation, but then actually translating them into 3D in a way that wasn't going to take me millions of years. That was a bit of trial and error. So you sometimes get that, like, a prop can seem really simple from the get-go. The lantern, I was like, well, I can see there's a lot of repeating elements, so it's pretty much all one material, so it shouldn't be too hard. But then you'll sometimes hit sticking points that you hadn't kind of considered. Maybe you've not worked with that kind of item before. And that's when you have to, you just have to kind of say to your lead or your client or whoever, like, oh, I need a little bit more time to work this aspect out.
So I just noticed in the chat, I think they're having a few issues with the microphones in the studio, so they're just posting into the chat. So I'll have to be the voice of the students for now. There's a few here that quite like this one in terms of specialism. Like, do you have to choose if you go down sort of organic or hard surface, or can you sort of choose to study a mix, or is it best to sort of specialize?
It again depends where you're aiming to apply for. Studios will have different kind of roles. They'll have different expectations of artists. It's a difficult one because it almost goes into kind of like career advice. I think if you're starting out and you haven't kind of decided where your love lies apart from 3D, then there's so many generalist roles. I actually did a talk at EGX a few years ago about kind of alternative career paths. I think it's changing now. Obviously, there's a lot of talk in this kind of game sphere about buyouts and companies all becoming one, but like for a few years past, I think people kind of saw these massive companies and thought that was like, that's the goal, that's working games. But it's actually not. Like, there's so much now, especially like with VR and metaverse. There's so many kind of industries and types of games companies and types of non-games companies that require 3D artists that I definitely would advise people to look, at other types of roles outside of the big, the big companies. Obviously, that is kind of how I started as well. I went in as like a 3D generalist at a very small company, and I kind of like, as they got more successful, I kind of rode that wave, and it also in turn gave me more responsibility. It taught me more. I was working on so many different types of games and briefs. So yeah, you can. I suppose there's like different routes, isn't there? You can hyper specialize, but then you have to kind of balance that against like there's going to be less companies that are looking for those very specific roles, or you can go a little bit more generalist and you can always specialize in the future, but you can maybe get some like more entry levels or junior roles that are a bit more kind of I guess generalized really.
Have you I don't know about sort of your thought on this, but I feel like I've noticed in the last few years, especially when you're talking about skills being able to transfer over different sort of industries as well. I feel like at the moment, Unreal Engine artists seem to be being picked up with like the VFX companies and things like that. Those who've got that kind of real-time engine experience seem to be getting sort of snapped up at the minute with sort of VFX and sort of TV and film. Have you sort of noticed that or agree?
Yeah, architecture as well. Actually, I mentor with the Mentor Coalition kind of sporadically, and I had a mentee last year who was just about to graduate, and they were really kind of fretting about getting into the games industry, and they weren't sure kind of what to do next. And actually kind of halfway through my second mentorship with them, they got a job with a sports company in America. It was like a sports broadcasting company in America. And that was for like an Unreal powered digital set. Kind of like how BBC Sports uses. I think Match of the Day uses Unreal as well. So yeah, there's so many kind of industries around it popping up that are are still working with the same tools and, pay well, and you're working in, a very lucrative area. So yeah, I always recommend to people to kind of look what's out there as well.
Got one here from Andrew saying, do you often get bored with 3D modeling at all, or any of the projects that you get assigned?
Not projects, but yeah, sometimes there's some weeks where I'm not feeling as creative. Like I absolutely love my career. It's like my bread and butter. I love it to bits, but it is a job at the end of the day. And like with any job, there's some weeks where I'm just like, oh, I'd rather be off in the sun.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's tedious bits where, maybe you're on optimization and everyone kind of like laughs. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that stage of the project. You might be bug fixing, you might be optimizing assets, or maybe there's like you've put something into the engine that's like broken loads of stuff, and then you've got to troubleshoot it. Sorry. So yeah, there's times where it's a bit drier, or there's maybe more admin work or more optimization work, but they're not that common. But yeah, it's a job at the end of the day, a really fun, exciting job. But
so moving on, so how would you sort of find inspiration for sort of new work or sort of personal work?
personal work, that tends to be an easy one for me, because I think I go down little rabbit holes on the internet anyway. So I'll see something that's like interesting. I've got a folder on my PC of just like cool things I've found, or I've been walking about and I've taken a photo with like a kind of mental note of, oh, I'll look at this later. Professionally, it does tend to be like I'll have like either a call with like my lead or client or whoever, and we kind of spitball and bounce ideas, and that kind of invigorates me enough to kind of start that initial research path and get inspired. And obviously as well, like looking at what other people have done. I'm always like on Twitter and ArtStation and seeing what like amazing people have been putting out, especially over lockdown, what people have been stuck in.
Mm-hmm. With the sort of COVID and remote working, so what would you consider important in sort of in a working environment sort of setup, like space, equipment, that kind of thing, to help, sort of mentally? Has it been more challenging? Has it been, in terms of, because I've noticed there's a lot more remote jobs coming up lately, sort of off the back of sort of COVID and working from home. So what's sort of been your experience of that, I suppose, against working in the studio?
I think I adapted to it kind of well, because I'd already been working remotely for Decagon for like a year or so before COVID hit. It fluctuates though. It's almost kind of cyclic. Like there'll be like 3-4 months where I really love it, it feels great, and then there'll be like a month or so where it's it starts to get a little bit, oh, I've not left my house in a while. I mean, I'm very lucky that I've got my own office, but I definitely recommend, if you haven't and you are taking a remote job, look in your local city or town and see if there's any kind of remote hot desking. Some places, especially if it's a more kind of gentrified area, they'll offer kind of very cheap studio space. So that's definitely something to look into if you do take a remote job and like need to get out a little bit. But in terms of like team practice, I would say good communication is key. Not always in meetings, because having too many meetings can actually be quite tiring for people. It kind of, there's studies going on about how like there's a certain type of exhaustion that comes from just constantly being on calls as opposed to like being face to face all the time. So yeah, like, but still like regular meetings, but not too many. Clearly communicating your work, making sure that if you are working on an asset or a level or whatever that you're doing, make sure that you're reaching out to the people that you need to, and keeping people in the loop. Get comfortable showing your work when it's not finished. You'll be working with other creative professionals. They understand that, what a work in progress looks like. But get comfortable, keeping people in the loop, because you're not going to have that organic like kind of people walking around the office and seeing what's on your monitors. So you do need to find a kind of replacement for that.
I think that's a really, really important point, actually, because I think for the majority of students, I think would agree with me saying that they have that almost fear of showing work in progress, and it's like they want to finish or show only finished sort of pieces of work. But often, like, showing that work in progress and those sort of unfinished work is, when you get the best feedback and stop you from going off down the wrong direction sometimes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And you do sometimes, like, not everyone is good at giving feedback, and you will sometimes get people that, you'll write out a big message being like, this is work in progress, but you might sometimes still get people, especially if they're not artists, who maybe don't kind of realize as much. And in those situations, even now, I'm a bit like, oh, about it, but you just kind of have to, I guess, develop a little bit of a thick skin and just kind of take it on board and be like, yep, it's a work in progress. I hear what you're saying, but don't be afraid to push back on things as well. You don't be overprotective about your work, but you can defend your decisions, or if you are showing something that's loose and sketchy, you can remind people of that.
Yeah. And so, it's going back to what you mentioned a moment ago, I think is a big thing for our students, especially over COVID, is maintaining focus sort of whilst working from home. And I think you mentioning that almost either hiring an office space or having a space to go and do work that's outside of the house, I suppose, can help maintain that sort of focus and separation, isn't it, from your sort of from home and work, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I've definitely found it more difficult, because even though I'm quite lucky, I've got like my own office space here. I've found it more difficult to work on personal work in the last 2 years, because I'm working remotely for Ubisoft, but I'm still in the past I would finish at Coatsing, I'd get the train back, it'd be a 20-minute train, and that's enough of a disconnect. And then I'd come home and I'd either do personal work or I'd do stuff for Decagon. But that does make it a bit more difficult, because even though I'm blessed to have like my own working space, I can't do that mental shift as easily, because it sometimes feel I've just been sat here for like 14 hours.
Yeah. And then sort of going back to sort of more portfolio based stuff, and for people who might be thinking about going down the sort of generalist route, what kind of work would you sort of advise sort of showcasing if they're more of a generalist sort of mindset?
If it's environment, because obviously I can only speak to environments really, then if it's environments, you probably want to show, one prop that's like a kind of good fidelity, well textured, well presented. Maybe one kind of either like a diorama or an environment, even if it's quite a simple environment, and you just kind of, even if it's just a block out really, but with like nice lighting, kind of like the example I showed in the presentation. Obviously, they'd prefer to see a fully fleshed out space with like textures and materials, but at least show that you can build out spaces and that you can work with engines. And then maybe kind of like like a material either done in like designer or sampler or mixer, or done with photogrammetry. And you could also show some examples of like photogrammetry as well, since that's becoming a more popular kind of technique. So I'd say they're like the 3/4 main points you want to hit. But the importance is that they're all like they're all to a good standard. It's that kind of age-old thing, isn't it? It's quality over quantity.
And with the photogrammetry side of things, how do you see that affecting your role as a prop artist?
It's hard to say at this stage. Obviously, it's hard to say, because like studios are all adopting it in different ways. For me, it's something I've been getting into, like just in my personal time, because I feel like it is, if not now, it is going to eventually become, very integrated into pipelines, especially for, kind of, if you are working on a game that's like set nowadays, and it's very easy to go out and kind of scan things. Obviously, Megascans released their new tree pack the other week, where they've kind of scanned like whole libraries of trees, and they've got like complex systems worked out to work in Unreal. So the potential there is huge, and there's a lot of kind of very passionate advocates for photogrammetry. But I think like with anything, it will slowly get integrated into kind of being commonplace.
And I suppose for sort of the more indie and sort of AA studios, the sort of traditional method would always be relevant and used anyway, won't it? Where it's not like it will completely overtake. There's sort of those traditional skills are always going to be valid.
Plus, if you're working on like a fantasy game or a historic game, then you obviously can't go and scan things from like the Viking era, really. So, you can probably like use elements of photogrammetry for things that don't change, like grass or like trees. But yeah, there's always going to have to be people with actual art skills, because it is like a creative medium at the end of the day.
Yes. And I suppose with that, how do you go about, especially if working full time, got some personal work and life, how do you go about keeping up with the ever changing and evolving sort of tools and sort of the industry, and like everything? It's almost like there's an update almost each month, and new software comes out. Like, how do you find sort of keeping on top of it all?
It is difficult, especially the more senior you get and the more responsibility you take on in your normal job. For me, as I said, it's got a little bit more difficult with remote working to kind of keep on top of everything, just because I don't want to be, in this room every single day, and at weekends too. But yeah, generally I'll again use Twitter and Reddit. Actually, it has some like good kind of like photogrammetry and game dev communities. Discord obviously is a big one. So I'll NAT level as well. Like the magazines like that, they'll kind of release like student highlights. So it's basically a case of just doing your best. Like you're never going to be expected to know everything. Even within kind of 3D teams I've worked on, different people have different strengths, even within specialities. So I guess it's a case of just kind of try and keep your finger on the pulse, read things where you can, when you can, and just try and be aware, really.
I suppose another question I wanted to pop through. So yeah, as kind of coincides with the question I was going to bring up anyway, with ArtStation generally can be quite an intimidating place for professionals or sort of alike, but when students are sort of starting to kind of think about their portfolios, it can be quite sort of intimidating, the thought just of posting up their own work for the first time. But how would you go about sort of, or advising beginners to start actually getting their portfolio and showing their work and sort of, I suppose, building their reputation?
So my answer is probably at odds with a few other people's, because I know there's like a lot of people are quite passionate about how ArtStation should be the standard for portfolios. And I get where they're coming from, because sometimes like if navigating through like random websites that are really badly formatted is a nightmare when you're trying to like do when people have like applied and you're reviewing for jobs and stuff. But I actually think so. I have my own website on top of my ArtStation, and for me, that website and Twitter is where I'll post work in progresses, and Discord as well. Obviously, it's a little bit different for me because I've already got stuff on ArtStation, so I'm not that bothered about updating it. But I find having that kind of judgment-free area, especially my own website, where I can put stuff up. And you've got things like kind of Squarespace and Wix and stuff now, where it is really easy to just get like a very minimalist, easy template, and you can just put your art up. And then at least if you're approaching people for feedback, I'd recommend getting your own domain name so it looks like kind of you're not got all like the really long ones that you get with free accounts, but you can just send people your website, and then it's almost like only people with the link are going to be able to view it, and it can sometimes take away that intimidation. Obviously, in kind of addition to that, I wouldn't worry about ArtStation. Like no one's out there judging you. I wouldn't feel that just because there's kind of industry veterans that have been in the games for like 20 years of posting, that that you shouldn't feel like gatekeeped, or that you're not deserving or not good enough. But I can understand as an artist as well, because I have also felt like that. And that's just the way I got around it, was having my having Twitter and my own website to like almost put like unfleshed out ideas.
Yeah, and I think areas like kind of Twitter and Discord they're really sort of informal communities, aren't they? So you kind of build up that kind of nice supportive network as well. Whereas I feel like ArtStation is almost like the final formal sort of output to sort of present your portfolio, isn't it? Whereas like the other areas are just sort of more supportive communities rather than necessarily ArtStation, where yes, there's the comments and stuff like that, but it's less personal interaction, I feel, than say Twitter or Discord. We've got one, where is it? How often would you say take freelance or outsource work, and do you juggle that, and would you juggle that with perhaps your studio work? Do you do it simultaneously, or is it kind of when you've got sort of time away? How would you kind of, or when do you decide to take on that additional work?
So one thing to be aware of is a lot of studios have non-compete clauses, which will rule out any freelance work while you work for them. Normally, I'll get that negotiated, like on a case-by-case basis. In previous jobs, I would ask for that to be removed from the contract. That depends how willing the studio are to allow that, how junior, senior you are, etc. So that's one thing to consider. Always be careful, like if your full-time employer allows freelance. If not, do they at least allow submissions, like to allow it, basically. In terms of juggling, it's still actually something I struggle with. I'm notorious for taking on too much, much to the annoyance of all my friends and family. But yeah, usually I've got a lot better at it now. Like, I'll only take stuff on if I know that I only dedicate maybe 2 evenings a week and maybe 1 or 2 weekend days a month. So I'm much better at kind of negotiating timelines with clients now, because I have been very, very badly burned out like a few years ago. I was working at Coasting, I was working for Decagon, and then I took on 2 additional freelance projects in the space of a month. I was also a lead at Coasting, so I had all the kind of inherent responsibilities that come with leading a project. And I didn't believe in burnout. I think I thought I was like invincible, and then I got it really badly. So yeah, you learn pretty quickly how to balance things. But yeah, so I now try, and I almost view it as like, well, how many times would you go to the gym in a week? How many times would you do a hobby in the week? I use that same kind of time frame, and maybe like two days a week.
That's good. What about when you're sort of developing or learning? What do you feel is the most, I mean, I suppose this would be personal to each and every artist, but what do you think is the sort of hardest element of the pipeline, sort of to learn or get your head around, or as an artist? Or do you feel like there's a certain area of the pipeline that most people struggle with more than others, or is it just sort of more individual to the sort of artists?
I think it's quite individual. I personally am less familiar with like shaders. I've got better in the last couple of years of kind of understanding complex shaders and working with them. But it's certainly the area that doesn't come as naturally to me. Whereas, for example, organization, planning, brief writing, and kind of naming conventions, engine implementation, their stuff, like that kind of organizational side of it, comes quite naturally to me, but not as much to others. So I think it depends, entirely on the person, on the artist. Again, like the kind of place that you're working as well. Like, yeah.
So I suppose there's one here, I think quite a lot of the students struggle with in terms of UV wrapping. Like, how have you got any advice to people approaching or coming up with or developing their knowledge of UVs? Or is that a common thing that you find is often sort of a challenging area for people to get their head around?
UVs, it's like it's quite similar to like learning to drive. I don't know how many people in the audience like have learned to drive, but you know, you've got all this mechanical stuff, and there's so much to think about, like gears and pedals and everything, and it can seem when you first start just like there's almost like a logic that's not quite setting in yet, and you're kind of going through the motions, and there's lots of buttons, and you can sort of do it, but you're not, you know, it's not quite sunk in. And I'd say UV is quite similar. It's the thing that, because it's such a strange concept and the tools look very strange, it can be quite intimidating at first, and coupled with the fact it's fiddly as well. But it's almost like something sinks in eventually, and now I don't even think about it. I just see it's like it's a thing I have to do. And you obviously also have tools like Rhizome and 3ds Max are kind of upgrading their tools. You've got Blender as well, which has really good unwrapping tools. You've got a lot of plugins and scripts for the Autodesk suite as well. That you've got so much automation and kind of assistance there now compared to there was like, you know, even 6-7 years ago. It very quickly, it's almost like something clicks and then suddenly you kind of understand it. There's always like tips and tricks to learn. There's some maybe kind of, you know, like I mentioned in the presentation about straightening your UV shells and stuff, and you can learn to pack better, or you can learn where to kind of overlay UVs and stuff to save space. But generally, it will just eventually click.
I suppose, and when you're with the UVs and straightening out those shells, do you find it's kind of a balance between straightening and sort of stretching?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's always going to be like a tiny bit of distortion. So it's like it's weighing up how bad the distortion is versus how much you save in terms of space from the UVs being like straightened and well packed together. And you do have things like when you're texturing in Painter and when you're baking in Marmoset, they're so non-destructive now that even if you bring something in and you bake it and you're like, oh, that's a bit weird, or you're halfway through texturing it and you're like, oh, I didn't notice that distortion. They're so kind of flexible now that you can just go and like fix the low poly, rebake it and re-bring it in, and usually, as long as you've not done like really horrific changes, the software can kind of recalculate the textures.
So you've got a question here, which is, how often do you play games? And is this a big inspiration, or is it kind of, you know, I find quite often we get a lot of students who are they kind of put the two together, but quite often you'll find quite a lot of artists don't necessarily play games, or is it a big part of sort of your inspiration yourself?
So yeah, I laughed because the answer is I don't anymore. Oh no, that's a lie. I do sometimes play games, but it's almost, so I was always into RPGs, MMOs and RPGs, like I always have been. And I think when I went to uni, or just before I went to uni, that's when I kind of branched out, probably because similarly I kind of thought I should be, that if I worked in games, I should know everything about games, and I should just like, you know, kind of absorb all of this media. And it's almost like now I've got older and I have less time. I've just resorted back to playing like JRPGs and the occasional MMO. And I do look at the art, or if my partner's playing something, I might like have a look. I might ask him to zoom in. I'm like, let me look at that plant pot. I want to see how they've done it. But no, generally my inspiration tends to come from ArtStation and like what my peers are up to. If there's something that I'm working on that I'm not finding much reference for, or if it's a very like big significant asset and I'm like, oh, I'm not quite sure how to tackle this in an optimal way, I'll probably actually will go and look at how other games have done it, and kind of what quality, you know, it looks like in screenshots, or I might find like a Let's Play or YouTube and stuff. So I do definitely still look at games 100%, but I don't play them as much in my like as a kind of enjoyment medium anymore.
And what about, do you have like a favorite sort of genre of stuff to work on? Like,
Not really. Again, I'm pretty project agnostic. To me, it's about the brief and the style guide and the team more than the projects themselves. I think if I had to pick anything, I would really love to work on a horror game. Like I played the new Resident Evil Village. I played that, and I was just in love with the art. We barely got through the missions because I kept looking at things. But yeah, I think I would love to work on a horror game at some point.
Brilliant. I think there's one last question in terms of, I suppose, do you listen to music when working? I suppose going on from that, do you have anything that helps you keep focused? And I suppose me adding on to that, one of my pet hates, I suppose, as a lecturer is when I'm looking over students' work and on one screen they've got their work and on another screen they've got like YouTube.
Oh, I do that. I'm terrible for if I'm unwrapping or I'm baking or I'm doing something that's a little bit more like I suppose not mindless, but I'm kind of just getting in the flow of something. Yeah, I'm really bad for watching YouTube documentaries. Anything about weird internet stuff, I'll 100% have on my other screen. But no, if I'm doing something that requires concentration, yeah, I'll probably have like some it changes. Sometimes I'll listen to really kind of extreme like metal, and then sometimes I'll listen to lo-fi. It depends on my mood. But there's one site that I actually really like for concentration. It's kind of like the rainy mood one, but it seems to be less known about. It's like an LA police scanner, but it overlays really chill music with live police scanners from Los Angeles, and you can change the city, and it's really good, like kind of white noise to just get in the flow. But yeah, no, for sure. I always have YouTube on.
I can't do it. I can't focus. For the most time, I need like a completely silent room for me to sort of get in there. And sometimes I even put headphones on without music playing, just so people think that I'm listening to music and they won't bother. But anyway, has anyone got any last questions before we take another break? Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now. We'll take another break. We'll come back at 3 o'clock, have another comfort break, after which what we'll do is we'll put you into a breakout group, and this is where things may go wrong. And so you'll go into a breakout group, and then I'll put the individual students in the list that I've got in order with you. But you don't have a chat box, you can't access the chat. So the students might have to sort of let me know when they're done, and then I can sort of switch them over. You might have permissions yourself, or you should have permissions yourself, but if you can't access the chat box, I don't think you can access it. But we'll just see how it goes. And then whilst you're doing that, I'll stay in the main room with everyone else. And if you've got any questions relating to the university and the course in which that we offer here, and then I can sort of address those questions. But thank you very much, Hannah. That was great.
Thank you for all the questions. It was super fun to answer.
Yeah, it was great. I think there's some really good questions in there as well. So if I've missed any, sorry, I do apologise. There's quite a few there. But yeah, okay, we'll take a few minutes and we'll come back at 3 o'clock.
Amazing.
Cheers.
Thanks all.